Hello, this is me here with Study History with Mr. P, and in today's video I'm going to look at changes in punishment in the period 1900 to the present day as part of the Crime and Punishment Unit. So there were changes to punishments in a number of ways, including the abolition of the death penalty, changes to the prison system, specialist treatment of young offenders, and the introduction of alternatives to prison. So I'm going to pick through these one at a time, starting with the abolition of the death penalty. So execution had been used less as a punishment from the beginning of the 19th century, but politicians had been unsuccessful in introducing laws to end it. By the start of the 20th century, capital punishment was used still for murder. Then in 1908, the Children's Act ended hanging for under 16s. The 1922 Infanticide Act said that mothers who killed newborn babies were no longer to receive the death penalty. In 1933, hanging of under 18s ended. In 1949, a Royal Commission on Capital Punishment was set up, and in 1956, the Death Penalty Abolition Bill passed the House of Commons, but was rejected by the House of Lords. But in 1957, the Homicide Act limited death sentences to 5 categories of murder. And these were committing 2 murders on different occasions, committing murder in the course of a theft, killing someone by shooting or explosion, killing someone while resisting arrest, or killing a police or prison officer. In 1965, the death penalty was indeed abolished from most crimes, and this was in a large part due to the work of the Home Secretary at the time, Roy Jenkins, as well as changing attitudes in Britain and the impact of controversial executions during the 1950s. Then lastly, in 1998, the high treason and piracy were no longer punishable by death, and in 1999 the death penalty formally ended, although the last executions had taken place many years before. So controversial executions is something I mentioned a minute ago. And it was these high-profile controversial executions which in part led to the ending of the death penalty. One example was Timothy Evans. He was hanged for the murder of his wife and baby, but later evidence proved they had been killed by a serial killer, and there was huge public outcry at this miscarriage of justice. In 1953, a young man named Derek Bentley was hanged for the murder of a police officer. Now, Bentley had learning difficulties at a low mental age and did not actually fire the gun, and in fact I've got a separate video coming out which will look at the Derek Bentley case in a bit more detail. And the third example is that of Ruth Ellis, who was hanged for the murder of a violent and abusive boyfriend. He had attacked her when she was pregnant and caused her to miscarry. She also had a young child who was orphaned by the execution. And at the time, a petition with over 50,000 signatures was ignored by the Home Secretary. And it's controversial executions like these which shaped the mind of the public in saying, well, actually, public execution at all for any crime was no longer fit for purpose and suitable. Now, the prison system itself, which we found out about in the time period, particularly 1700 to 1900, changed again and significantly during the 20th century. So ideas about the purpose of prison and the type of treatment prisoners should get changed. At the end of the 19th century, in 1896, mental prisoners were treated separately to other prisoners, and it led to the opening of Broadmoor Hospital. In 1902, hard labour ended in prison, which meant no more tread wheels in prison. From 1907, some alternatives to prison began to be used, and I'm going to explore that a bit later in this video. 1922 saw an increased focus on prisoner welfare and led to the end of the separate system, as well as initiatives introduced to improve conditions and educational opportunities for prisoners. And from 1933, there was greater emphasis on preparing prisoners for life after serving their sentence. This led to the creation of open prisons that had a more relaxed regime and day release for prisoners. Alongside this, in the prison system, we also see specialised treatment of young offenders. So Borstalls came first. In 1902, the first Borstal opened in Kent, a prison for boys that kept them away from older criminals. And in 1908, the Prevention of Crime Act introduced a national system of Borstalls. The focus here was on education rather than punishment. The day for the inmates was structured and disciplined. Inmates took part in exercise, education and work programmes. and reoffending rates were at 30%, whereas today it's crept up to 60%. But these borstalls were replaced in 1982 with youth custody centres. So there were a series of youth justice reforms during the 20th century. In 1948, for example, there was the Criminal Justice Act, which reduced the use of prison for juveniles and improved the probation service for young people. The reforms in the 1948 Act included a graduated system of prison detention centres as a deterrent to young offenders that were more relaxed than borstalls, and attendance centres of young offenders convicted of minor crimes. The 1963 Children and Young Persons Act focused on the importance of caring for and protecting young offenders, and the age of crime or criminal responsibility was raised to 11. The 1969 Act introduced specialised juvenile courts and care and supervision orders. Previously as well, in my video, I talked about alternatives to prison. So modern courts often use alternative punishments to prison that focus on reform and rehabilitation. For example, ASBOs or antisocial behaviour orders, which are a court order that places restrictions on what a person convicted of a crime can do. For example, where they can go, who they can talk to. And they are usually issued to people who've repeatedly behaved in an antisocial way. There's also drug and alcohol treatment programs for people who've become involved in crime because of problems with drugs or alcohol. Community service, where people convicted of minor crimes often do supervised work to improve their local community. Restorative justice, where a criminal meets the victim of their crime or relative to talk about what they've done and to understand the impact that it's had on others. And electronic tagging, where the court orders a person convicted of a crime to wear an electronic tag. Using the tag, they monitor the criminal's movements, and although the person is not in prison, their movements and activities can be strictly controlled.